Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chad Weston. I'm co-founder of Traction House. We're just waiting for a few more minutes to get the rest of our attendees onboarded, just waiting for people to check in. We're going to get started in a few minutes. Okay, we are going to get started. We've got about 55 minutes left with our time together. So first off, I just want to thank you so much for taking some time to join Simon and I. Simon's my business partner, and I'm going to introduce him in a second with this hour together. We really just hope that this brings you guys good value and really sparks some good quality thinking around how to optimize your content strategies and your online approach to help attract particularly sophisticated investor profiles and personas, financial advisors, the kinds of people that are in high demand for attention and are traditionally just used to getting a lot of bids for their attention. And so hopefully Simon and I today, the real focus is going to be on a system that we use and we're finding quite helpful to create participation with complex investors and buyers who have sophisticated needs and don't have a lot of time to hang around and check out other people's content. And so let's jump right in. So just to situate ourselves for the afternoon, we're going to start off by talking about the 2019 attention economy. And basically, what does that look like and what are the implications for that in how you get on the investor radar? What are the steps and some of the trends that we're seeing in the industry that are contributing to a rise in digital marketing, social selling, and really just an investment in a content marketing and digital thought leadership approach online? What are the main drivers for that? And why are Simon and I promoting webinars specifically as a tool in the marketer and sales leaders toolkit to help move people along the discovery and the customer journey towards your fund. And then we're going to jump into some of the tactical side. So we've got a three-part discussion today. The first part is, excuse me, how to draw attendance. One of the largest challenges that we're finding with finance companies is one of the challenges that they note is getting attendance from sophisticated investors on their webinars. So we're going to talk about some of the ways that we can get that done. And then part two is really just an overview. This will be a little bit lighter, but an overview of webinars themselves, how Simon and I set up webinars, some of the different things to keep in mind when running the actual webinar itself. And then part three is the real KPIs that you want to focus on with respect to webinars specifically, and how that translates to return on investment. And then finally, we'll end off with a couple of some time together with some Q&A, and we've got some resources in place for you to walk away today with some good value. So just to introduce ourselves, I'm going to hand it over to Simon just to give you an idea of who we are and where what a bit of our backgrounds.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Chad. And I'll echo what you just said. Thanks a ton for joining us today. Hopefully we can provide you guys some good value. So for me, I'm originally from the eastern part of Canada. I've been an entrepreneur since high school. So I would put myself through university, and it's what I've done pretty much ever since. For the past 3 years, I've been living in San Francisco, living in Silicon Valley, where I've been helping teams essentially build up their marketing teams and then helping them run really good marketing campaigns. And it's a lot of what we're doing now at Traction House, but in the investment space. Something else that I guess I should mention is the Next Canada program that I was a part of a couple of years ago. And really what that program aims to do is to take the 36 top highest potential young entrepreneurs in Canada and then give them some money, give them some resources to really get them ready for the next step of entrepreneurship.
All right, awesome. And as far as I'm concerned, I just got a couple of quick wins, some fun projects in the past. Just want to note, I come from a creative design background, so a lot of my career has been spent consulting startups, penetrate enterprise decision-making groups, CEOs and C-suites present to boards, and a lot of pitch decks for VC capital and stuff. So this was obviously globally to really onboard them with product knowledge, soft skills, etc. So it was a lot of experience designing. My passion is designing presentations and communicating visually through digital channels. And so when Simon and I came together to form Traction House, it was a really good fit. And so we're excited, and we've got a lot of momentum that we're building. And we're hoping that what we have to share today is going to be valuable for you. So let's get started. So I want to start off. Simon and I have a big idea. We've got a big method that we think is very effective at doing investor acquisition online. But before we get into that, and we're going to unveil what that is in a minute, I want to talk about why now. I really want to create a sense of urgency so you guys understand why it's so important to be investing your exposure dollars in digital channels and specifically webinars. And we're going to borrow a quote from Bob Dylan. So in 1963, on October 26th, live from New York's Carnegie Hall, American songwriter Bob Dylan opened the evening with a title song that would soon become world famous. And originally he wrote that to be an anthem of change in the peak of the civil rights movement in America. And the song, and this line in particular, "You better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone because the times they are a-changin'." It was designed with a particular focus to be influential in people's view in society. Critics later noted that these lyrics particularly have contributed to the song's lasting message of change. And so today I want to borrow this sentiment to capture the essence of the shift. Margins are decreasing. We noted that TD Ameritrade did a study in 2017. At the end of 2017, and profit margins were down, RIAs across the board 20%. And there's increasing compliance costs. So just a lot of the incumbents, regulatory procedures like GDPR, et cetera, these are causing compliance costs to increase. And so there are some shifts happening economically that's making it more difficult for finance companies to consistently be profitable. And on the other side of things, when we say times are changing, what do we mean by that? Well, one of the biggest examples of times changing is disruptive incumbents, and particularly in our case, robo-advisors. And robo-advisors are making a concerted effort to penetrate the millennial and some of the older investor conscience, and they're painting a picture that alpha isn't sustainable. Human services are just typically overpriced nowadays. Fees and a rebalanced risk-managed beta are really all that matter, and that new technology versus the human touch deliver a better experience and a lower cost base. And so these kinds of messages succinctly being delivered by the robo-advisor communities are slowly starting to shift investor sentiments and stuff. And so there's a couple of things at play here that are a threat to traditional means of raising funds and doing investor acquisition on a traditional level. And so this is one of the things that we're seeing in the industry, and what are the reasons why it's important to be digital now and to be with the times. The good news is this. Forbes had an article that we picked up that basically Bain Capital Ventures did a survey of 556 Americans with, high net worth, $250,000 to $10 million of investable assets. Top financial concern for this group was post-career retirement planning, which makes sense. But what caught our attention was the fact that human attributes like trustworthiness and listening skills ranked highest, where fees actually weren't that important. People are willing to pay higher fees if the human attribute is there, if they've got someone that they can trust, someone that they feel understands them. And so that's a saving grace. That's definitely something that's good to lean on, but it is good to be aware that there is some disruption coming and happening in the industry. And to break that down further, I just want to take a look at 3 core pillars of market forces at play that are changing the investment acquisition landscape. And so there's a bit of a paradigm shift happening, and we characterize this in 3 categories. The first one is economic forces, which I talked about. So this is fee compression, this is rising compliance and operating costs. Mike Philbrick, who many of you be familiar with, he's the CEO and president of Resolve Asset Management. He's a real big fan of digital. He's a big fan of the social selling movement in finance space particularly. And so he mentioned recently that the wholesale model is quickly becoming obsolete, and asset managers are going to need to find new ways to reach their end consumers. On the social side of things, there's a big movement towards what's called self-education. 57% of research in complex purchases, and I would put investments in that category, are now done online prior to meeting with a real person. As well, the social habits of the institutional groups, as another example, 97% of institutional investors, this was a study done by LinkedIn, now use digital sources for investing, and 79% use social media specifically. So even though you may think institutional investors are still very much a wine and dine environment where you don't really get their attention unless it's in person, there's actually quite a bit of awareness building and work that you can do preliminarily in the digital space, even with institutional investors, to really prime them and prepare them for the offline engagement. And finally, on the technological side, there's some technology forces at play. We'll skip through that. And particularly, there's 2 things I want to point to. There's the commoditization of once costly enterprise marketing technologies. So it's no longer the case that a marketing stack that will do end-to-end full funnel attribution, lead scoring, omni-channel digital presence, and social listening needs to cost millions of dollars a year. There is a drop in the overall cost of marketing tech stacks that pack a punch. They do a lot of horsepower. So you can actually it's making things more accessible for mid-market and small businesses to participate in the digital space and to make noise online and stuff like that. So, it used to be the case that you would go to Bloomberg.ca, and often who you'll see is RBC and Fidelity and BlackRock. But Simon and I are keenly aware that it's not that expensive for a small unknown hedge fund to achieve visibility on Bloomberg, on the banner ads and stuff like that as well. So there is a bit of an equalization in the playing field happening on the technological side. Perhaps one of the biggest things to note is the rise of the robo-advisor. And when it comes to looking at the idea of moving someone through a purchase decision completely digitally without talking to a human being, the rise and the success of the robo-advisor movement is an example to just demonstrate that people are willing to arrive at a place where they're comfortable enough placing money at a technology without there being a human involved. And so this is a management by 2020 and up to 16 trillion by 2025, which is, they note, 3 times the amount of assets managed by BlackRock right now. And so that's a pretty big number. And of course, with dollars in also comes user growth. You can see that there's a tremendous amount of new users adopting this robo-advisory movement and dispensing with the need to really have that personal touch. And so there's a bit of a disruption happening in the industry. This is some of the ways that we articulate that. And finally, on this quote, What does it mean when we talk about swimming and actually surviving and changing with the times? And Simon and I particularly are talking about digital means of demand generation. So these are terms like social selling, content marketing, systematic lead generation programs. And in particular, Simon and I are going to make the case for webinars today. But when we talk about encouraging funds and finance companies to swim and keep with the times, we're particularly referencing these kinds of activities and investing heavily in that. All right, so what's the big idea? Well, the big idea that we have is driving qualified investors to your firm using a world-class webinar program. And there's something about the webinar ecosystem that encompasses many valuable parts that a marketing manager and a sales manager values. And let's take a look at what that is. To understand the value of a webinar, we first need to understand the attention economy in 2019. Attention, as we all know, is the game in marketing. If you don't have a prospect's attention, you cannot start the process of influencing them, driving brand awareness, and creating engagement and different touch points on your digital channels. And so you've got to get their attention. Attention recently has become a very scarce commodity in the digital era. It's something that's much, much more difficult to come by today than it was in the 1970s or even the 1990s. In the 1970s, for instance, and this is one of the reasons why, they estimate we were hit with about 500 messages a day. So you'd wake up in the morning and throughout your day, there'd be about 500 subliminal and direct bids for your attention. Today, that number is between 4,000 and 10,000. And so the consequence of all of that information overload is we need to be particular about where we allocate our attention. We need to be very picky and choosy about what we do with our attention throughout the day. In a Forbes article, we picked up a nice quote that basically summarizes this, but at some point, what happens is there's a screening process for what we engage with, and we start to ignore brands and advertising messages unless it's something we have a very personal interest in. And so where is attention flowing today? Well, the obvious question is mobile is a big part of it, and so is digital. Mobile is taking over, but digital is obviously, as an overall ecosystem, really seeing an increase in the amount of eyeballs that it sees every day. And if you take a look at the digital space, these brands here dominate our attention. This is the overall attention per day on average per user. Facebook's 53, Instagram's 48 minutes, LinkedIn's 12, but I think that's increasing. Netflix is 85 minutes a day, so obviously we're an era that loves binging and soaking up content. YouTube's 40 minutes a day, etc. And we say that where attention goes, the money flows. And all you need to do is look at Facebook's mobile advertising revenues up to Q2 2018 to see that the attention is clearly in the hands of a very few large monopoly platforms. And but that does present an opportunity to be really sharply targeted toward. There's not a lot of time between a place of uncertainty to a place of certainty. Simple sales are situations where buyers move themselves to a place of certainty about a buying decision on their own, relatively in a relatively short period of time. And that's what's indicated on the left. The perceived risk is small, and they can rely on things like social proof. For instance, Amazon reviews is highly influential in purchase decisions to make a purchase decision. But with complex sales, and I would categorize investments to be part of the complex ecosystem, there's much more time involved, and to move the buyer from a place of uncertainty to a place of strong certainty. The sales cycle is much longer, there's more people involved, and there is a due diligence process in place to overcome the high perceived risk. So the critical takeaway here, obviously as marketing and sales managers, this stuff is nothing new. But the reason I bring this up is because a much larger chunk of the complex process, the process moving a complex buyer from a place of uncertainty to a place of certainty, is happening online through self-education. before talking to a human. And as we noted earlier, it's up to 57% of that certainty spectrum is being accomplished digitally now before bringing in a real person. And so that's a really important thing to think about. And so with webinars is situated inside of that 57% of the spectrum. It's situated in that digital space where you have an opportunity before talking to somebody in real life to influence at scale and to really distill your personality, distill your likability, distill and establish yourself as a brand expert and a thought leader. But tactically, webinars serve as not just a brand awareness platform, but as a lead generation platform. It's a two-pronged benefit. Because webinars are time-bound, we can create urgency and scarcity around it. We can drive a volume of leads in a short period of time to attend. It's live, it's personable, and it's much more engaging than some of the more passive content pieces like a research paper or a blog post, etc. And there's also longevities that you can get out of webinars, and Simon's going to touch on this in a little bit later on today. But once a live webinar like the one we're on today is recorded, you can replay an on-demand version of the webinar and generate a consistent volume of leads passively without your actual direct involvement. And the more you produce webinars on different topics that are interesting to your investor personas, the more that you can get fruit and benefits from on-demand webinar programs. So we think of webinars as what's called a spark event in the customer awareness journey. And so we have James here on the left, and James is about to discover a brand. And the webinar program serves as the spark event in the discovery journey of a high net worth retail investor or financial advisor. It's an effective way to let people know that you exist and why they should consider your offering. And this is a unique window, 30, 45 minutes, maybe even an hour, where you can personally influence a scale of investment prospects in a manner that's very difficult to do elsewhere online. Success can be measured. You can establish your key performance indicators. You can define what success looks like, and you can measure every component of the webinar program end to end and know if it's producing value for you right away. And like we talked about before, passive lead generation with replays. So Simon and I are big fans of webinars. We're all in on this program, and this is the reason why. Now, the biggest complaint that we get when we approach a prospect is attendance. Chad, attendance is so difficult. It's really, really hard, especially with complicated institutional level buyers or financial advisors who hate getting bothered. It's just a big, big problem. And it seems to be a problem across the industry. 78% of webinars, and this is a recent poll by GoToMeeting, which is a major webinar platform, 78% have less than 50 attendees. Well, if you're just trying to create awareness, 50 attendees, depending on your closing ratio and the qualified number of that 50 that's qualified, 50 isn't a very good ratio. You definitely want to be able to get higher than that. But as you move up in the attendance categories, the percentage of companies that are able to achieve high levels of attendance go way down. And so that's a big problem. That's something that Simon and I are optimizing to overcome on a regular basis, but this is a big issue. And to break down and articulate this problem, I'm going to hand it over to Simon to basically talk about some of the ways that he and I really drive sophisticated webinar attendees on our programs.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. Well, if there's that this is a relationship journey, talking about the financial space and investing. You have to be findable, you have to be reachable, and then you have to keep in touch. And like I just mentioned, LinkedIn was pretty much tailor-made for that. So it's a huge part of how you should be thinking about how you're going to get eyeballs on your webinars. So for our purposes, we're actually going to walk you through a quick scenario that we see happening with many of our clients. So this here is James. He's the Chief Investment Officer of a multifamily office in New York City. He right now has yet to discover your investment offerings. So with that said, how are you actually going to get James to attend your webinar? We like to break it down into 3 specific activities that fall under 2 groups. So the first one is advertising. So really what you're trying to do here is something that we like to call internally air cover. And really what you're trying to do here is you're trying to put your brand, you're trying to put your message and your unique value proposition in front of James, in front of whoever else fits those demographics. And one thing that's pretty fantastic about LinkedIn is that if you do have Sales Navigator, which is an add-on that LinkedIn offers, you can essentially build the persona, the profile of a James, of a CIO in New York City, and it'll actually generate a named list of individuals who fit that description specifically. What that then allows you to do is you can take that list and you can actually push content, right? So you can push personalized and hyper-targeted ads, blog articles, videos, webinars, etc. So that what happens over time is that James goes on LinkedIn, he's looking around, he's communicating with people, he's looking at the news, and more times than not, he's actually seeing your brand, he's seeing the value that you're delivering with your content. So over time, what starts to happen is that there's a level of trust that gets accomplished. There's a level of familiarity, and that level of trust and that level of familiarity is what we leverage throughout this entire process to make sure that our webinars are well attended, and it's something that you can do to make sure that your webinars are well attended. So here's really for me personally, I don't know about you, Chad, but here's really where the fun really comes in. And that's when we are going after more direct methods of getting eyeballs on our webinars. Think about awareness as maybe casting a wide net over a lake to catch some fish. These things here are more like having a spear and spearfishing fish out of the lake instead of that net. One thing that I really want to touch on here is how important personalization is. So what a lot of people do, what a lot of people actually tend to do at this stage is they'll send LinkedIn messages, they'll send emails, and the opening line is something like "Dear Sir" or "Dear Madam" or "Hi there." And to be quite blunt, that really sucks, right? As human beings, we want to feel like we're valued. We want to feel like we're being targeted specifically. So you got to make sure that whatever you do, it's very personalized. And I know that the example I just used is a name perfectly tuned into his acute pain points. So when it comes to getting a guy like James on your webinar, you have to deliver a personal white glove experience, and you'd better be offering topics that delivers serious insights on something that he cares about today and right now. Like I mentioned earlier, the great thing about LinkedIn is that it's essentially a database, and the numbers that you see on the slide here are real numbers from LinkedIn that we generated for you. If you actually get Sales Navigator and you put in the right search parameters, you'll actually be able to generate a list of 16,000 family office investors and all the other ones that you see there. Once you have those lists generated and you can actually see them, you're faced with the task of communicating with them through LinkedIn is that it does give you quite a few metrics about the amount of people that are looking at you, looking at your profile. We have some pretty interesting metrics on that based on some of the tools that we talk about. And something else to keep in mind is that people don't really answer cold calls anymore. So if you want to get in front of someone, you have to reach them on a platform that hasn't been, let's call it, sabotaged yet. And more on that in a little bit. One thing that we've done here at Traction House, which has been extremely useful, is we first started by doing these LinkedIn messages manually, and it can get it can get really time consuming very quickly. So what we did is we actually developed a piece of software that sends out personalized message to lists of individuals automatically. So essentially you can be going about your day doing whatever you have to do, and really our tool communicates and sends these personalized messages on your behalf. And essentially what happens after that is that you take a look at your messages at the end of the day, and you've probably gotten around 80 to 100 different responses. And those are all people that you can then take for coffee or do a one-on-one meeting with. So that's it for LinkedIn. And now what I'd like to focus on is is emails. A lot of people have been telling us that cold email is dead, and that could not be further from the truth. Truth is that it shouldn't be the first thing that you send. It should be something that you do after you've been running ads for a while and have about 6 to 9 brand impressions per audience member. And that's a math that's very easy to do on LinkedIn, because you know how many people are in your list. You know how many people are being hit by your content, by your ads. So it's easy at that point to look at the impressions that those campaigns are generating, to then go, okay, we've reached the right amount of unique impressions. Let's start sending these emails. The key at that point is really in how the email looks and how it sounds. If it looks overly designed, if it doesn't look natural, it's not all that great. To be honest, for us, we really try to make it seem like we sent it from our iPhones. And that's what seems to work. And again, I'm going to be a broken record here, but personalization is really important. You want to make sure that you use their first name, you mention their company, and you want to make sure that it's more than just this canned message that you're sending them. So now that at least you know how to get a large portion of your target market to want to interact with you, what should you lead their attention to? Like Chad mentioned earlier, I mean, we've done it all, right? We've from video to blog posts to infographics, even live events and seminars. But if there's one thing that keeps hitting it out of the park for us time and time again, it's these webinars. So what we'd like to do now, just to walk you through some webinar best practices based on what we've experimented with ourselves and with our clients. This here is the flow that we like to take on with our webinars and 100% of our marketing these days. The first thing that we advertise is a teaching series. So that's usually a 3-part teaching series that we do with the attendees, where we teach them stuff like what we're talking about today. Part of the attendees of that webinar afterwards will get an email right after the webinar has ended. And that usually is to one-on-one sales conversations, where essentially we have another webinar with them, but it's more of like a thinly veiled sales pitch where we answer their questions a bit better, and we get to talk about specifically what makes Traction House special and how we can help them do this in their business. And usually what happens after that is offline engagement. So if they are in the area, so for us, if they're in Toronto, we usually meet them for coffee, or if they're not in Toronto, we'll have a call with them. But by that point, what we mostly see is that the sale's been closed. We are not the only ones seeing this kind of success with webinars. I think Chad earlier did a wonderful job of explaining what makes webinars so great. 73% of marketing and sales leaders say that webinars are one of the best ways to generate quality leads. 73% is no number is not a number you scoff at. Some best practices here real quick. Attendees actually like longer webinars. It's something that we've seen ourselves. We've done 15, 20-minute webinars. We've done 2-hour webinars. We found that 1 hour is the perfect, it's a sweet spot. So we definitely advise that you do the same. Again, just longer webinars just really seem to do better. And what you want to make sure is you time it well during the day. So you don't want to do it too early. You don't want it too late. Keep in mind that webinars anyone in the world can attend. So you are dealing with time zones here. What's worked really well for us is exactly what we're doing today. So 12:30 Eastern. Timing during the day also is a big part of it. You'll notice that we're doing this on a Thursday afternoon for us here. And there's a lot of stats that back up that number. Something else that's huge is the evergreen function that a lot of these webinar tools have at their disposal. So you can record this once, and then you can actually use these tools to make sure that you show these webinars on a recurring basis. So essentially what I mean by that is every Thursday at 12:30, we could show a recording of this webinar. And then Chad and I, all we would have to do is show up at the end for Q&A. And that way what you're doing is every single week, you're bringing more and more people in that flow that we were just talking about, right? So the teaching series, the one-on-one call, and then the face-to-face meeting. And that has been it's been a bit of a godsend for us. It's something that we do every week, and it's been fantastic. A lot of webinar tools have some great built-in options to help you build engagement. And there's a lot of things that we do to make sure that engagement is being kept up throughout the entire thing. So ask the audience for questions, ask questions of the audience often. A lot of these tools have different polls that you can put within your webinar presentation just to get the audience a bit more engaged and participating. You're going to want to leave the room for audience questions, and you can actually provide resources as part of this. So at the end of this today, you guys are actually going to get a few resources from us, and that's all a part of that sequence. So now what I want to do is actually just pass it off to Chad, who's going to talk about, I think, the most underutilized part of all this, but also the most powerful.
Thanks, man. So this is really about taking a posture of listening on a digital, on a numerical level, and figuring out what's worth making sense of and focusing on and optimizing for, and what's not. If you've done a tremendous amount of work optimizing your promotional outreach, you've got sophisticated investors to come and hang out with you for an hour. You've got some fantastic teaching material and some real good value add that you're presenting within the webinars. The real logical next step is to understand some key metrics and continue to optimize towards these key metrics. And there's a thing in the marketing world called vanity metrics. And vanity metrics oftentimes are metrics that people like to boast about, but they don't really mean a whole lot. These are things like registered users, downloads, raw page views, or signups. They're easily manipulated. They don't necessarily correlate to numbers that really matter. When it comes to webinars in particular, there are 12 key KPIs, key performance indicators, that Simon and I pay attention to. I'm just going to be some examples of webinar vanity metrics that really don't mean a whole lot to us. One of them is ad impressions. Just because you're blasting a bunch of awareness out there doesn't mean your messaging is good. It doesn't mean it's relevant. It doesn't mean you're actually going to get traffic or traction from it. It just means that all that really indicates is that you're spending a lot of money to make a lot of noise. But it doesn't really indicate much that's important. Registration page views. Okay, so that's something that's kind of neat. You've got a consistent flow of traffic on your registration page. Very cool. But again, if no one's signing up, and really the registration page is just, you've got a high bounce rate, that's not something you want to be proud of either. And finally, just raw leads don't really cut it either. Just having a bunch of named people that show up in your webinar really doesn't indicate how this will translate eventually to revenue. And what you want to look for is more like qualified leads. And so we're going to spend a couple of minutes just to wrap up the webinar, and then we're going to jump into some Q&A and some resources here. We're just going to talk quickly about these 12 KPIs. This is what Simon and I really focus on with our clients. This is what we pay attention to. It's what we care about. The first one's total spend. Everything starts with this. Simon and I, inside of our live reporting, we're absolutely transparent about the all-in dollars that it's costing a client. Or if you're running an internal team, you really want to make sure you've got your finger on the pulse of the total budget spend for your webinar program. And that can be calculated by looking at your overall platform costs. If you're renting a technology platform like On24 or BigMarker or GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar, you want to know what those things are costing you on a month-to-month basis. You want to know the amount of hours that your marketing team is putting into producing the webinars, if you're outsourcing for design, if you're outsourcing for script writing, if you're hiring guest speakers and bringing in high-profile presenters to, cross-pollinate with their audience. You want to keep a detailed track of what that costs. So the first thing you want to establish is the total spend to put on a webinar program, because then you can benchmark everything from that. And obviously at the very end, you can, if you've got an accurate idea of what you've spent, the beautiful thing about a webinar program is it's all digital. You can get a pretty accurate picture of your return on investment for the webinar, or at least the projected return on investment, if your sales leader knows his numbers like closing ratio, average deal size, or lifetime value of an investor onboarding, and the sales cycle time. You can use those numbers to create a pretty decent projection on what this webinar will produce for you. All right, the second KPI we look at is ad click-through rate. So ad click-through rate is the number of, this is obviously going to be probably quite familiar with for most of you, but for those of you who aren't, it's the number of impressions that are generated omni-channel. So if you've got a webinar promotion running on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, the Google Display Network, which is 2 million sites like Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, etc., all the eyeballs that have seen ads but not clicked on them. That's impressions, okay? The click-through rate is the number of people that clicked on the ads relative to the number of views or the impressions that were generated. And across the industry, a decent click-through rate for platforms like LinkedIn are typically around 0.2 to 0.3, 0.4%. If you're getting 0.8 to 1% or above, Simon and I look to that as a benchmark to see that our messaging is relevant. We've got a good audience that's responsive and engaging. So that's a good sign. Ultimately, what click-through rate represents is your ability to efficiently move traffic from the initial discovery pool, which is, the audience is spending their time on their social feeds, and efficiently moving a percentage of that traffic onto your webinar registration. So that's the first conversion. Is you want a good conversion rate on the click-throughs, because that's how you get people to show up to your registration page. And then you want to pay attention to the registration page conversion rates. The industry average for webinars is between 35 and 50%. We're aiming typically for 50 to 65%, 70% on our landing pages. But essentially, if your landing page isn't converting well, it means that you're really not doing a good job creating excitement and buzz around the upcoming webinar. You're not leveraging scarcity. You're not leveraging urgency. So you don't have necessarily a countdown timer, limited seating available, messages like that really motivate a registration to happen. So you want to pay attention to registration conversion rates. Registration to attendance ratio. So the industry average drop off is about 50%, 50 to 70%. So if you have 100 registrations that happen in the 3-week promo period leading up to a webinar, if 30 show up and actually attend the webinar, that's typically the industry average. So if you can get that to 50 or 60%, that's a really good number. So that's registration to attendance ratio. Okay, cost per attendee. How much dollars does it cost for each person that comes to your webinar? That's a good thing to know. You definitely want to have an idea of how many dollars you're spending per attendee to purchase that window of 35 minutes or 45 minutes of exposure and influence to that person. Average view time is going to give you an idea of how your actual webinar deck and your topic and your presenter and the overall live webinar experience is doing. If you're seeing the average view time, if most people are dropping off in the first 10 or 15 minutes or 30 minutes, you really need to gut check the deck itself, the slides, the presenter, the topics. Something's off there. If people are dropping off like flies, something is not right, and you're not really delivering and keeping momentum through your thematics and your topics. And so you really want to make sure that your deck is clean, well designed. You've got an energetic, articulate industry expert in the topic that you're talking about, and you want to keep that dynamic level up and keep people interested. And as Simon alluded to, running polls early and often, making time for questions in the end, all that stuff are important to do to keep the engagement level up and keep viewers paying attention to you throughout the full hour. Okay, qualified leads. So before you actually run the webinar, before you spend any money on promotions, you really want to make sure you do your homework and define what a qualified lead is for you. what's the minimum investment criteria that your firm takes in? What are typically the profiles? Is it if it's an institutional or a pension fund or an endowment, what are the titles within those groups that really matter to you, and what are the titles that are just too junior for it to matter? So you want to make sure that you're generating a volume of qualified leads on the other end of the webinar. And if you can do that, typically, you can interact with your marketing leaders, can interact with the sales leaders and figure out what that looks like. But typically sales leaders can look at a list of qualified leads, and on average, based on previous track record, know that 15 or 20 qualified leads represents X money in revenue, and etc. So the final two really have to do with revenue. At the end of the day, the cost and the resources required to put on a webinar need to translate to dollars back to the firm. And webinars, if the webinars are not a profit center, if they remain a cost center, they're not going to be attractive, and it's going to be more difficult to justify. So very quickly, you need to turn your webinars into a profit center. You need to have a system in place to attribute revenue back to the webinar. So if James, our fictitious chief investment officer in New York, eventually comes in, checks out a webinar, 9 months later, allocates to your firm, you want to make sure that you're checking and looking back at James's discovery touch point to attribute revenue credit back to the webinar for bringing James into the funnel and really moving and sparking what we talked about earlier, sparking his discovery along the journey towards your firm and towards engaging someone offline and placing an allocation. And then finally, at the end, webinar return on investment. If it costs you $3, $5, $10, $15, $20,000 to produce a webinar series, are you ultimately breaking even on that spend in the form of incoming allocations from sophisticated investors or financial advisors referring funds to their clients, etc. The beautiful thing about digital, and we don't have time to get into it today, but the beautiful thing about running a webinar program is it's acutely measurable. So you can set up a marketing tech infrastructure to do webinar ROI breakthrough calculations. So you can know for certain that the dollars you're spending on your webinars, the cost per attendee, are actually translating to real dollars back to the firm. And so that's ultimately what matters. And so Simon and I work hard to make sure that we're bringing that kind of clarity to you. All right, guys, just to finish things off, we have produced an ultimate webinar checklist for finance managers. So if you are looking to take what we've learned today and really put it into action, checklists are a great way to at least move through a process from planning the webinar to promoting it to driving attendance, running a successful webinar, and then doing something with the leads afterwards. This is something that's attached in the resources tab. So on the right-hand side of your screen right now, you should see a resources tab, and you should see two documents. The first one will be this webinar checklist for you. And then the second one is the slide deck today, so that you can take these slides and take them offline and review them. But that pretty much wraps it up. We just wanted to first off thank you so much for your time today. We hope that this has been valuable. We hope we've brought at least sparked some interest towards webinars and really piqued your interest on an understanding of why they're relevant in today's attention economy and why and their role overall in client acquisition and investor acquisition. So at this point, Simon and I would be happy to take any questions that you guys have.
All right. So the first one here, do you need Sales Navigator to use LinkedIn messaging?
Why don't you grab that one?
Yeah. The short answer is no, but it definitely helps. And the reason why that is because when you have Sales Navigator, you have about 23 parameters that you can use to specify a list. As opposed to when you don't have Sales Navigator, I think you have something like 7 or 8. So just like the lists that you can create, the lists that you can generate on LinkedIn without Sales Navigator are a lot more limited than otherwise.
Perfect. Okay, there's one here. What's a good opening message on LinkedIn? Yeah, that's a great question. So when it comes to cold touches, yes, people are definitely more responsive on LinkedIn to a cold outreach versus something like cold email or cold calls for sure. And so for us, the initial message that goes out on an automated basis to connect requests on LinkedIn is typically in the form of an invitation to connect. And there's a limit that LinkedIn sets, which is 300 characters. So you really got about 300 characters to work with to pique the guy's interest, make yourself relevant, and at least earn yourself a first connection and the ability to continue a conversation in your LinkedIn message. And so for us, the key things we focus on are something like, hey, John, hope you're having a good day. Just came across your LinkedIn profile. I wanted to share some ideas with you. I think you and I operate in the same space. I would love to, share some ideas or connect. I've got a couple of things I'm working on that I think you'd find interesting. Let's connect and continue the chat. Cheers. Something like that. So it's very invitational, very passive. It's not aggressive. It's not salesy. And in this technique, typically we consistently see between 50 and 60% first connection response rate. So in our tool, for instance, we run 150 automatic connection requests every morning from your LinkedIn account to your key prospects. And with a message like what I just articulated, typically we see about between 40 to 50, sometimes 60% connection response rates back. So out of that 150, you'd see between 60 and 80 new first connections come in.
Wonderful. Yeah, and the last thing about that too is there's a lot of power in the follow-up. So if someone connects with you but doesn't message you back with your first message, just follow up, and we've seen some pretty tremendous things happen just from that.
Yeah.
So the next one here, how do ads and messages complement each other? Yeah. So we talked about that a little bit earlier, but I'm happy to talk about that some more because I think that's some pretty interesting stuff. The ads themselves act as air cover, and really what happens is you're just trying to get more people who fall in your exact target market to know about your company. So you're trying to build brand familiarity. And then as you're running these ads, as you're running this content through the LinkedIn platform, you'll see how many people in your list have actually seen it. Once you get to an okay number, we say about 6 to 9 times per individual who's on your list, then you'll want to go with the messages. And that's not so much about generating brand awareness. That's a lot more about starting a conversation, being very intentional about it. So that's kind of how they complement each other. One, make sure that they know about you. And two is once they know about you, once they trust you because of all your great content, you're actively trying to start a conversation with those people.
All right. Should the marketing tactics of robo-advisors and traditional asset managers differ? Well, I mean, the outcome for robo-advisors is to move an investment prospect through a decision-making prospect pretty much digitally at scale. So, I mean, a robo-advisor would want a retail investor to discover their brand digitally, do their research, self-educate, and arrive at a place of certainty where they're comfortable enough to allocate funds without really talking to a human. And that's obviously, with robo-advisors, they operate in a similar fashion to a SaaS-based digital business where it's really hands-off for the onboarding process, at least for simplified decision-making. So, I mean, I think where they differ is the endpoint for a traditional asset manager typically is still going to be an offline conversation. There's going to be a lot of human contact. We're definitely not promising that by doing webinars, you're going to, do $100 million in AUM in 1 year or something like that. It's certainly going to require a lot of human connection and whining and dining and the traditional stuff. But really, webinars are situated in that first 50 or 7% of the research phase. And so we definitely think that webinars for traditional asset managers have a rightful place in impacting and creating influence and building a base of trust inside of that, in that spectrum where they're moving through and becoming more convicted and convinced of your brand and your offering. But it won't take them all the way to the same point that a robo-advisor would. So robo-advisors, I think they're trying to accomplish the full spectrum digitally, completely, whereas asset managers, it's really the beginning stages of the customer discovery journey. As I mentioned before, I would place a robo-advisor in a simple sale ecosystem. So it's something that you can put in $500 or $5. It's a no-brainer type thing. Whereas a traditional asset manager who takes in a minimum of $25,000 or $50,000 to a hedge fund, that's a complex sale. That's more touch points. That's a more complex due diligence process. So certainly, there's a much longer, more involved approach to moving that person to his level of certainty where he can place and allocate with your funds. Okay, we got time for one more question before we got to jump off. It's from, let me just get to this. It's from David. So David asked, with a LinkedIn campaign, do you know who's clicked through to your ads? And if not, when in the process do you see the names and other details in the leads generated? Thanks, Dave. So yeah, one of the tools we use is called Kissmetrics. So it's an identity tracking. It's kind of like Google Analytics on steroids. And with Kissmetrics, what they do is the point a person becomes known is when they voluntarily give up their information on a form. And so in a registration context, it's a registration page for a webinar. And so before they give up their information and submit a form and check off the terms and conditions boxes, they are what's called an AR. But on LinkedIn specifically, with Sales Navigator, you can distill a list of folks. Like one of the audiences that we mentioned is about 9,000 or 7,000 family office contacts. So these are CIOs at family offices. You can pull up that list and know who they are at the audience level, and then create that as an ad audience and run a webinar promo at them. But you won't know who they are until they come out on the other end and actually register and attend your webinar. So I hope that answers your question. All right, guys, thank you so much for spending time with Traction House today.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, we haven't had time to get through all the questions, but do email us, and we'd be happy to chat offline. We hope this has been valuable to you. And until next time, just have a productive day. We'll talk real soon.